It is black midnight over the Alexandrov Sloboda, a fortress lost in the forest, the heart of a new and terrible power. The air is thick, heavy. It is saturated with two smells that will come to define the era: the sharp, sweet incense from the chapel, and the acrid, nauseating smoke from the torture fires. Inside, in the half-light of the prayer room, lit only by thin wax candles, stands a tall, gaunt figure in a simple monk's robe. This is the Tsar and Grand Prince of all Rus, Ivan Vasilievich. His lips silently whisper canons of repentance, his bony fingers grasp a prayer rope, and his deep sunken eyes burn with a fanatical fire. He makes prostrations, hundreds of them, his forehead striking the cold stone floor with a dull thud. In this ecstatic, self-forgetting act, one can see the depth of his faith, the faith of a man who genuinely believes himself responsible before God for every soul in his tsardom. But listen closely. Through the pious whispers of prayer, other sounds break through from the adjoining chambers. There, behind the thick walls, another ritual is underway. Wild laughter, the clash of cups, women's shrieks, and the death rattles of the dying merge into a hellish symphony. This is his brotherhood, his sovereign's dogs, the Oprichniki. After a day of bloody work, they give themselves over to debauchery and new executions. Dressed in black like their master, they carry out his will, serving as both his sword and his curse. And in this monstrous contrast, between fervent prayer and ruthless slaughter, repentance and torture, lies the central, unresolvable paradox of the era. How could the most devout of all Russian Tsars, a man who spent more time in prayer than on the throne, create this satanic guard? This is not just a historical riddle. It is an abyss in one man's soul into which the entire country was destined to fall. And to peer into it, we must return to the world that spawned this angel and demon in one crown. The Tsardom of Muscovy in the mid-16th century was a world of contrasts, a titan trapped in aging armor. On European maps, it was already a giant, sprawling stain, the heir to Byzantium and the Third Rome, the last bastion of true Orthodox faith. But beneath this imperial gilding hid a reality full of anxiety and instability. The state had only recently thrown off the humiliating yoke of the Golden Horde, but it still felt the phantom pains of the past. From the south and east, remnants of the Horde, the Crimean and Kazan Khanates, still launched devastating raids on its borders, living reminders of past slavery, demanding constant tribute not only in money, but in blood. To the west, a different but no less dangerous chess game was being played. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, united with Poland to form the powerful Commonwealth, was an eternal rival, challenging Moscow's right to gather the Russian lands. To the north, the Swedes and the Livonian Knights controlled the Baltic, cutting Muscovy off from vital sea trade routes and technological exchange with Europe. This geopolitical isolation, this feeling of being a besieged fortress, forged a unique national character, suspicious and harsh. But the main threat festered not outside, but within. The Grand Prince's power, though considered divine in nature, was, in reality, fragile. The country was ruled by an invisible but all-powerful aristocracy, the Boyar clans, the Schwiskis, the Belskis, the Glinskis, the Vorotinskis. They owned vast estates, maintained their own private armies, and viewed the sovereign more as a first among equals than as an absolute master. Their intrigues, their struggles for influence at court, their petty disputes over precedence, where noble birth was valued more than military talent on the battlefield, turned governing the state into an endless tug of war. The tsardom was a patchwork quilt, loosely stitched together from former principalities, and every powerful boyar was ready to pull at his own patch the moment central authority weakened. It was into this world, full of external enemies and internal traitors, a world in desperate need of a strong steel hand, that Ivan IV arrived. Every ruler is a product of their dynasty, and Ivan IV was no exception. He was the son of Vasily III and the grandson of Ivan the Great, the very sovereigns who had transformed the modest Muscovite principality into a vast tsardom, gathering the Russian land with fire, sword, and cunning diplomacy. From them, he inherited not only the blood of the Rurikids, who, according to legend, descended from the brother of the Roman Emperor Augustus, but also a great, almost sacred mission: to complete their work, to turn Muscovy into an indestructible Orthodox empire. This idea of divine destiny, absorbed with his mother's milk, became the core of his personality. However, along with this great inheritance, he received a terrible curse, the curse of an orphan. He was only 3 years old when his father, Vasily III, died. Power passed to his mother, Elena Glinskaya, an intelligent and domineering woman of Lithuanian origin, whom the boyar nobility hated as an outsider and an upstart. For 5 years, she ruled with a firm hand, suppressing conspiracies and continuing her husband's policies. But in 1538, she died suddenly, and persistent rumors spread through Moscow that she had been poisoned. For 8-year-old Ivan, it was a catastrophe. He and his younger brother Yuri, left as complete orphans, were transformed from heirs to the throne into defenseless hostages in the hands of the power-hungry boyar clans. The Kremlin chambers, which had been his home, filled with an atmosphere of fear and hatred. The boy watched as the boyars plundered his father's treasury, how they argued and fought right in front of him, paying him no attention. He saw his few loyal servants and friends dragged away to be executed. He and his brother were often left hungry, dressed in ragged, threadbare clothes, humiliated and abused. This period, known to history as the boyar rule, became Ivan's school of survival and his university of hatred. He saw with his own eyes that for the boyar aristocracy, their clan's honor and selfish interests were more important than the good of the state. And it was then, in the dark and cold chambers of the Kremlin, that an icy conviction was born in the soul of a lonely, frightened child. The boyars are treason, an ulcer on the body of Russia, and to save the country, that ulcer would have to be burned out with a red-hot iron. The era in which Ivan grew up was saturated with mysticism and a belief in omens. Every natural phenomenon, be it a comet, an eclipse, or a drought, was interpreted as a divine message, a hint of things to come. The birth of the heir to the throne, for whom his father Vasily III had waited so long, was itself surrounded by an aura of exceptionalism. Chronicles report that in the hour the future Tsar was born, in August of 1530, a terrible thunderstorm broke over Moscow. The sky split with lightning, and thunder shook the earth. This was immediately interpreted as a powerful omen. Some saw it as a sign of great victories and prosperity for the state under its new ruler. Others, more superstitious, whispered that it foretold an era of great upheaval, blood, and turmoil. This dual symbolism, this birth in the storm, became forever attached to his image, later giving rise to the nickname Grozny. This didn't originally mean cruel, but rather awe-inspiring and mighty, like the thunder itself. Ivan, who was deeply religious and well-read from childhood, undoubtedly knew these legends and believed them. This faith in his own chosen status, in the idea that God himself had marked his birth with celestial fire, became the cornerstone of his worldview. He was not just a ruler, he was God's anointed, an instrument of providence, destined to shape the fate of his people. He perceived any resistance to his will not as political disagreement, but as sacrilege, as a rebellion against God himself. This conviction in his divine mission gave him incredible strength and determination during his years of reform and great conquests. But in dark times, it twisted into a terrible justification for limitless cruelty. If you are the hand of God, then your anger is God's anger, and your punishment is divine retribution. The prophecy of the storm, therefore, came true in the most terrible and complete sense. Ivan did indeed bring his land both the purifying fire of great deeds and the incinerating lightning of unprecedented terror. If childhood is the forge where character is hammered out, then Ivan's forge was hell itself. After his mother Elena Glinskaya's death, the 8-year-old boy found himself in the eye of a hurricane of boyar greed and cruelty. Power in the state was seized by rival factions, first the Schwiskis, then the Belskis. These men, drunk on their sudden freedom from a strong hand, felt no need to hide their contempt for the young sovereign. To them, he was just a symbol, a living icon to be paraded before the people during ceremonies and ignored the rest of the time. In his letters, Ivan would later recall these years with bitterness and hatred. He wrote of how the powerful Prince Andrei Schwiski would, without shame, put his dirty boots up on his late father's bed. He remembered how he and his deaf-mute brother, Yuri, were often left hungry, how they, the heirs to a vast empire, wandered the empty, echoing chambers in worn, ragged clothes. But the humiliation and neglect were only part of the nightmare. The main thing was the fear. He would wake at night to noise and shouting as boyars burst into his bedroom, searching for their enemies or simply demonstrating their power. Before his very eyes, the few people who were kind to him were seized and dragged away to be executed. He lived in constant fear of death, never knowing whom he could trust. His only escape and solace was books. Unlike people, books did not lie or betray. He devoured everything he could find in the Kremlin library: holy scriptures, lives of the saints, Byzantine chronicles, stories of the great rulers of the past, Alexander the Great, Augustus. From these books, he drew two fundamental ideas. The first was the divine origin of power and the monarch's immense responsibility to God. The second was the bitter knowledge of human depravity, betrayal, and cunning. Thus, his character was formed. On the one hand, deeply religious, educated, and a statesman in his thinking, and on the other, pathologically suspicious, secretive, vengeful, and convinced that the world was a nest of snakes, and it could only be ruled with an iron fist, knowing neither pity nor mercy. The silent, frightened, and humiliated boy, whom the boyars had grown accustomed to ignoring, was growing up. And while they were busy looting the treasury and settling scores with one another, they missed the moment when the beast inside him awoke. One day in December 1543, the cup of his patience overflowed. The 13-year-old Ivan, who had never before shown his will, suddenly did something that sent a chill of pure terror through the entire boyar court. During another meeting of the Boyar Duma, he, quiet and unnoticed, suddenly stood up, and in an icy, unchildlike voice, accused the most powerful of his guardians, Prince Andrei Schwiski, of treason and villainy. The boyars were stunned by this audacity, but it was only a prelude. Ivan gave a short command to his kennel masters. "Take him!" Before anyone could react, loyal servants seized the bewildered prince, dragged him into the courtyard, and threw him to a pack of hungry hunting dogs. The savaged body of one of the most noble dignitaries in the state lay in the Kremlin square for hours as a terrible warning. This was not just revenge. It was a political manifesto written in blood. This single act revealed everything that would become the essence of Ivan the Terrible's future reign. First, the theatricality of the cruelty. The execution was public, humiliating, and symbolic, for the Schwiskis themselves had behaved like dogs. Second, the reliance on common men personally loyal to him, the kennel masters, in opposition to the high-born aristocracy. Third, the absolute and unlimited will of the monarch, who is himself the law, the judge, and the executioner. For the boyars, it was a shock. They suddenly realized that the puppy they had been kicking had grown into a wolf, and his fangs were lethally sharp. From that day, the era of boyar rule began to end. Ivan did not yet have full, real power, but he had demonstrated the most important thing, his will. And that first blood, shed on his command, became a terrible but intoxicating revelation. Violence was the most effective and understandable language his enemies understood. Behind every great historical deed lies not only political calculation, but also a deep, often irrational inner motivation, an inner demon that drives a person to great achievements and great crimes. For Ivan IV, that demon, his obsession, the alpha and omega of his entire worldview, was the concept of autocracy. But this was not just a desire for absolute, unlimited power, like many other monarchs. For Ivan, autocracy was a religious dogma, a sacred mission given to him by God himself. The humiliations he endured in childhood had convinced him that any form of collective rule, any concession to the aristocracy, was a direct path to chaos, turmoil, and the destruction of the state. In his eyes, the boyars were not political opponents. They were bearers of a mortal sin, pride, that led them to place the interests of their clan above the interests of God's established order. He, the Tsar, was God's anointed, his living icon on earth. Therefore, any attempt to limit his power, any disobedience to his will, was not just a state crime. It was blasphemy, a rebellion against the Creator himself. This idea, reinforced by his extensive knowledge of Byzantine history and Orthodox theology, became a true obsession. He was not just seeking power, he was seeking a sacred, mystical union with his country, where his will would become its destiny. He believed that he alone bore the burden of responsibility for saving the souls of all his subjects, and to fulfill this mission, he needed absolute, unlimited authority. This demon of autocracy was simultaneously his creative and his destructive force. It pushed him toward great reforms, toward expanding the state's borders, toward creating a centralized government. But it also made him intolerant of any dissent, turning political opponents into enemies of the faith, and any failure or betrayal into an apocalyptic battle between good and evil, where he, of course, was on the side of good. It was this fanatical faith, forged in childhood fear, in his sacred right to unlimited power, that became the seed from which, years later, the bloody tree of the Oprichnina would grow. Having come of age and been crowned Tsar in 1547, Ivan IV began his reign not as a tyrant, but as a wise and far-sighted reformer. This period, which lasted about 10 years, is known as the time of the Chosen Council, an informal government, a circle of talented and dedicated advisors whom the Tsar brought close to him. This circle included men of various origins: the intelligent, low-born nobleman Alexei Adashev, the priest Sylvester, who held enormous moral authority, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a brilliant military commander, and Metropolitan Makary, the young Tsar's spiritual mentor. This was a unique alliance in Russian history, a monarch working with the best minds of his time, aimed at the comprehensive modernization of the state. Instead of taking revenge on his childhood tormentors, Ivan seemed to channel all his energy into constructive work. The main achievement of this period was the creation of a new legal code, the Sudebnik of 1550, which standardized laws across the country, limited the arbitrary power of local governors, and introduced elements of class representation in the courts. The peak of this trend was the convening of the first Zemsky Sobor, or Assembly of the Land, in Russian history, a gathering of representatives from different social classes, a kind of equivalent to a European parliament. Although its functions were advisory, its very existence signaled the Tsar's desire to rely not only on the boyar aristocracy, but on broader segments of the population. Military reforms were carried out, creating a standing army, the Streltsy. The systems of tax collection and local self-government were put in order. In these years, Ivan appears as the ideal sovereign, pious but enlightened, strong but just, listening to wise counsel, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of his country. It seemed the nightmares of his childhood were behind him, and Russia, under his rule, was entering a golden age. Nothing yet hinted that this same reformer, this creator of laws and proponent of social dialogue, would in a few years become its dark opposite, a despot who trampled all laws and drowned the country in blood. But this is the heart of the tragedy. The Oprichnina would not have been such a shock if it had not been preceded by this bright era of hope. Having strengthened the state from within, the young Tsar turned his gaze to the external threats that had plagued the Russian lands for centuries. The main threats were the remnants of the Golden Horde, the Khanats of Kazan and Astrakhan. These were predatory states that controlled the vital Volga trade route and launched regular raids on Muscovy's eastern borders, carrying off thousands of people into slavery. For Ivan, this was not just a geopolitical task, it was a holy war, a continuation of his ancestors' work to liberate the Russian land and affirm the Orthodox faith. The campaign against Kazan in 1552 became a national cause, a true crusade. A massive army of 150,000 men, personally led by the Tsar, marched east. The siege of Kazan, a mighty fortress considered impregnable, became a triumph of Russian arms and engineering. Under the direction of the talented engineer Ivan Virodkov, a giant mobile siege tower was built, and a mine was dug under the fortress walls. After a massive explosion destroyed part of the fortifications, Russian troops stormed the city. The battle was incredibly fierce, but in the end, the city fell. This victory was of colossal importance. It not only neutralized a centuries-old threat from the east and opened the way for the colonization of the Volga region in Siberia, but it also had a huge ideological effect. In the eyes of the entire Orthodox world, Ivan IV appeared as a new Constantine, a victorious Tsar who had crushed the infidels and expanded the borders of the Christian world. His authority within the country soared to unprecedented heights. 4 years later, in 1556, Astrakhan was annexed almost without a fight. The entire Volga route was now in Moscow's hands. Ivan was at the zenith of his glory. He was not just a Tsar, he was a hero, a living legend, the fulfiller of divine destiny. This grand success further strengthened his belief in his own chosen status and the righteousness of his cause. But, as so often happens in history, the greatest triumph became the prelude to a fatal mistake, one that would eventually consume both the victor and the fruits of his victory. Intoxicated by his success in the East, Ivan IV made what was perhaps the greatest strategic mistake of his reign. He decided the time had come to break the centuries-old blockade in the West and reach the shores of the Baltic Sea. Control of the Baltic meant direct trade with Europe, access to advanced technology, weapons, and specialists, without which Russia's further modernization was unthinkable. The pretext for war was the weakness of the Livonian Order, a knightly state in the territory of modern-day Latvia and Estonia, which was in a state of deep decline. In 1558, Russian troops invaded Livonia, and at first, the war went well. Narva, Dorpat, Tartu, and other important fortresses were taken. It seemed that with one more push, the age-old dream of access to the sea would become a reality. However, the Tsar and his advisors had underestimated one thing. All the major players in the region were also interested in the Livonian inheritance. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Poland, Sweden, and Denmark all entered the war against Russia. A short, victorious campaign turned into a grueling, endless war on multiple fronts, which became known as the Livonian War and lasted for a quarter of a century. It demanded a colossal exertion of all the country's resources. Taxes rose, peasant farms were ruined, and the army suffered huge losses. Victories were followed by defeats, successes by failures. This war became the bottomless pit into which all the state's resources vanished, and the anvil on which the Russian army, economy, and the people's very endurance were tested. For Ivan, accustomed to quick and decisive victories, the protracted nature of the war, the constant setbacks, and the need for compromise were sources of terrible irritation and frustration. He began to see the cause of the defeats not in the strength of his enemies, but in internal treason, in sabotage and betrayal by the boyars, who, in his opinion, did not want to see the Tsar's power strengthened. The Livonian War became the dark backdrop against which the Tsar's personal tragedy would play out, and it ultimately served as the catalyst for the darkest and most violent instincts slumbering in his soul. In every person's life, there are figures who become their guiding stars or their evil geniuses. For Ivan IV, the two poles that defined the trajectory of his fate were two people: his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, and his close friend, Prince Andrei Kurbsky. Anastasia, who came from the not very prominent but ancient Zakarian Yuriev boyar family, was chosen as his wife at a bride show. This marriage, initially political, turned out to be exceptionally happy. Contemporaries described her as a woman of astonishing beauty, kindness, and wisdom. She was the only person who could soften the Tsar's harsh and volatile temper. Her quiet, beneficial influence, her support and love were the anchor that held Ivan in the harbor of sanity and moderation during the first, brightest years of his reign. She bore him 6 children, including the heir to the throne, and was not just a wife to him, but a true guardian angel. His relationship with Andrei Kurbsky was completely different. A talented general, a hero of the siege of Kazan, an educated man and a brilliant polemicist, Kurbsky was not just a commander, he was a friend and a comrade in arms from the chosen council. He belonged to that new generation of servicemen on whom Ivan wanted to rely in his struggle against the old, high-born aristocracy. The Tsar trusted him, valued his intellect and courage, and saw in him the model of an ideal servant to the throne. But fate decreed that these two people would become symbols of two opposing forces in Ivan's life. Anastasia became the embodiment of love, loyalty, and stability, the bright world he so desperately wanted to build. Kurbsky, as it would turn out, would become for him the most terrible symbol of betrayal, the personification of all his deepest fears and suspicions. While Anastasia lived, her light balanced the darkness in the Tsar's soul. But when she was gone, and his friend proved a traitor, that balance was broken forever, and the darkness burst forth, consuming everything in its path. In 1553, shortly after his triumphant return from the Kazan campaign, Tsar Ivan Vasilievich fell gravely ill. The illness, likely a fever, was so severe that the court began to prepare for the worst. Sensing death's approach, the 23-year-old monarch decided to secure the future of his dynasty. He summoned the boyars to his deathbed and demanded that they swear an oath of allegiance to his only son, the infant Dmitri. And then, something happened that forever poisoned Ivan's soul and became the point of no return in his relations with the aristocracy. Instead of immediately carrying out the will of their dying sovereign, the boyars began to hesitate. Many of them openly declared that they did not want to serve a babe in swaddling clothes and be subservient to his relatives, the Zakarians. Instead, they proposed passing the throne to the Tsar's cousin, Prince Vladimir of Staritsa, a grown and experienced man. There was a certain logic to their actions. The country was tired of rule by child Tsars and regency councils, and they feared a repeat of the chaos from the boyar rule. But to Ivan, lying in a feverish delirium, this was not a political calculation. It was blatant, brazen betrayal. At the most tragic moment of his life, as he was bidding farewell to the world, the men who owed him everything, on whom he had showered favors, refused to fulfill his last wish and swear allegiance to his lawful heir. He saw in their eyes not concern for the state, but a lust for power and gloating over his imminent death. Only with enormous effort did his loyal followers manage to force the boyars to take the oath. Against all expectations, the Tsar recovered. But he was never the same. The wound inflicted on him in those days never healed. He had seen with his own eyes that even his closest and most high-born nobles were ready to betray him at any moment. The seeds of suspicion, planted in his soul during childhood, now produced an abundant and venomous harvest. He did not punish anyone then, but he forgot nothing and forgave nothing. This episode became a terrible lesson for him. He could trust no one, and to secure his power and the future of his dynasty, it must be built not on trust, but on fear. After the brilliant conquest of the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanats, Ivan IV's authority reached its zenith. He was no longer just the Grand Prince of Moscow, one of many European monarchs. In the eyes of his people and the entire Orthodox world, he had transformed into a figure of truly epic proportions. The official ideology of the time, formulated by Metropolitan Macquarie, proclaimed him the direct heir to the Roman and Byzantine emperors, and Moscow as the Third Rome, the last and eternal bastion of the true Christian faith after the fall of Constantinople. Ivan himself deeply and sincerely believed in this concept. His coronation as Tsar, taking a title previously held only by Byzantine emperors and horde khans, was not just an act of political pride. It was the acceptance of a sacred responsibility. He was the Tsar, that is, the Caesar, God's anointed, to whom God himself had entrusted the fate of the Orthodox world. This moment of supreme power was also a moment of supreme temptation, known in Greek tragedy as hubris, pride that challenges the gods and fate. Ivan, seeing enemy fortresses crumble before him, seeing ambassadors from distant lands bow to him, seeing his people revere him as a living saint, began to believe more and more in his own infallibility. He came to believe that his will was a direct expression of providence, and his plans were the plans of God himself. This dangerous illusion, reinforced by real and grandiose successes, began to blur the line for him between the personal and the political, between his own desires and divine predestination. He began to think that he had the right to do anything, and that any doubt in his wisdom or righteousness was tantamount to heresy. It was this hubris, this certainty in his exceptional mission, and his absolute right to judge and punish, that prepared the ground for the coming tragedy. When fate dealt him its first blows, he perceived them not as the natural course of events, but as the schemes of the devil and his earthly accomplices, the traitorous boyars who dared to oppose God's chosen Tsar. And his response to this challenge was not that of a politician, but the fury of an Old Testament prophet. At the height of his fame and power, when it seemed that fate was forever on his side, a series of misfortunes struck Ivan, heralding the coming storm. The first blow was the tragic and senseless death of his firstborn son and heir, the infant Dmitri. During a pilgrimage to the Kirilo-Belozersky monastery in 1553, the royal wet nurse stumbled on the ship's gangplank, and the Tsarevich fell into the river and drowned. This loss was a terrible blow to the Tsar and Tsarina, but the real collapse of his world came 7 years later. In August of 1560, after a prolonged illness, his beloved wife, Tsarina Anastasia, died. Her death was not just a personal tragedy for Ivan, it was an event that split his life and his personality in two. He was inconsolable, but his grief quickly turned to rage and suspicion. The Tsar was absolutely convinced that Anastasia, who had always been in robust health, had been poisoned by his enemies, the Boyars. He accused his closest advisors from the chosen council, Alexei Adashev and the priest Sylvester, of using their influence over the Tsarina to take her from him, and ultimately to destroy her. Modern analysis of the Tsarina's remains did, in fact, find high levels of mercury, which could indicate poisoning, though in those times, mercury compounds were also used as medicine. But for Ivan, there was no doubt. In his mind, already poisoned by suspicion after his illness in 53, Anastasia's death became irrefutable proof of a massive Boyar conspiracy. He had not just lost his wife, he had lost the only person he trusted implicitly, his moral compass. The light in his soul went out. The world, in his eyes, was transforming from an orderly, God-blessed tsardom into a snake pit full of traitors and murderers. And from that moment on, his main goal was no longer creation, but revenge, a terrible, total, and merciless revenge. Anastasia's death triggered a chain reaction that completely changed the political landscape of the Muscovite tsardom. Ivan, consumed by grief and rage, unleashed his full power on those he considered responsible for his tragedy, his former allies and advisors from the chosen council. Alexei Adashev and the priest Sylvester were the first to fall. Not long before, they had been the most influential men in the state, virtually his co-rulers. But now, the Tsar saw them only as cunning conspirators who had poisoned his wife and tried to limit his autocratic power. Sylvester was exiled to the remote Solovetsky monastery, where he died in obscurity. Adashev was sent as a military governor to Livonia, far from the court, where he soon died of an illness, though many believed he was helped to die. Their relatives and supporters were disgraced, executed, or exiled. The era of reforms and compromises, the era of the chosen council, was over. The Tsar no longer wanted to listen to anyone's advice or share his power with anyone. He disbanded the circle of wise advisors he himself had created, now seeing it not as a support, but as a threat. It was a fatal decision, a turning point from which there was no return. By removing moderate and far-sighted men from his side, Ivan surrounded himself with new favorites, men of low birth, often cruel and unprincipled, who owed him everything and were willing to carry out any order, no matter how bloody. The state machine, which he had so carefully built in the first years of his reign, began to malfunction. The governance of the country increasingly depended not on law and established procedures, but on the whims and moods of one man. The Tsar's paranoia, previously held in check by the influence of Anastasia and his wise counselors, was now unleashed. He began to see treason everywhere, in a failure on the battlefield, in a careless word, in a sideways glance. And the country, holding its breath, began to slide into an abyss of fear, waiting to see where the sovereign's unchecked anger would lead. If Anastasia's death was an internal psychological catastrophe for Ivan, the flight of Prince Andrei Kurbsky in 1564 was a political and ideological catastrophe. Kurbsky, as mentioned, was not just a boyar or a general. He was a hero of Kazan, one of the closest friends of the Tsar's youth, an active member of the chosen council, a man with whom Ivan had shared his most secret thoughts about Russia's future. And now this man, fearing inevitable execution after the fall of his allies, did the unthinkable. He betrayed his oath and fled to Lithuania, to the sworn enemies of the Muscovite state, taking all its military secrets with him. For Ivan, this was a devastating blow to the back. If even a man like Kurbsky could be a traitor, then who in this world could be trusted? This betrayal became the final, irrefutable proof for the Tsar that the entire boyar aristocracy was rotten to the core, an inherently hostile force ready to sell out the homeland for personal gain. But Kurbsky did not just flee. From abroad, he began to write accusatory letters to Ivan, charging him with tyranny, with abandoning the bright ideals of his early reign, with the unjust execution of loyal servants. And Ivan, to the surprise of many, accepted the challenge. A unique correspondence began between the Tsar and his former friend, a furious, passionate exchange, full of mutual accusations, theological arguments, and historical digressions. In these letters, Ivan the Terrible emerges not only as a bloody tyrant, but as an outstanding writer and political thinker. It was here, in this debate with Kurbsky, that he polished his theory of autocracy to a brilliant shine. He argued that the Tsar has the power not only to execute, but also to pardon his subjects as he sees fit. For his power comes from God, and he answers for his actions only to God Almighty, not to men. He angrily rejected the very idea that subjects could judge their sovereign. This correspondence became his way not only of justifying his actions, but of finally formulating the ideology of unlimited monarchy, which would become the theoretical foundation for his next, most terrible step. By the end of 1564, Ivan IV, driven to the edge by Kurbsky's betrayal, failures in the Livonian War, and his own mounting paranoia, decided on a political move that was unprecedented and brilliant in its audacity. One winter day in December, he, along with his entire family, his treasury, his icons, and his loyal servants, suddenly left Moscow, announcing that he was abandoning his state. He gave no reason. He simply left for an unknown destination, leaving the capital in complete bewilderment. The country froze. The Tsar, God's anointed, had abandoned his throne. It was unthinkable. It violated the entire established order of the world. Ivan settled in the Alexandrov Sloboda, a small fortified town about 60 miles from Moscow. From there, he sent 2 letters to the capital. The first, addressed to the Metropolitan and the boyars, was full of furious accusations. He wrote that he was renouncing his power because of the constant treason of the boyars, their unwillingness to serve the sovereign and protect Christians, their looting of the treasury and lands. He listed all their sins, starting from the time of his childhood. The second letter, addressed to the common townspeople, the merchants, and all the people of Moscow, was written in a completely different tone. In it, the Tsar informed them that he held no anger and no ill will against them. It was a brilliant political calculation. Ivan set the bad, traitorous boyars against the good people who had always been loyal to him. The effect exceeded all expectations. Panic erupted in Moscow. The boyars and clergy understood that without a Tsar, the country would immediately plunge into chaos and civil war. The common people, frightened and outraged by the boyars' treason, began to gather in the squares, demanding that a delegation immediately go to the Sloboda and beg the Tsar to return to the throne. This theatrical gambit, This feigned abdication allowed Ivan to transform himself from a sovereign who could be criticized into a savior of the nation whom they begged to return. He had left Moscow as a czar they were angry with. Now he was being summoned back as a messiah, the only one who could save the country from ruin. Ivan's plan worked perfectly. A massive delegation consisting of high clergy, boyars, and representatives of the Moscow merchants arrived at the Alexandrov Sloboda. With tears in their eyes, they begged the Tsar not to abandon his state and to return to Moscow, promising that from now on he would be free to reward his servants and to execute them as he saw fit. This was exactly what he had been seeking. He had received from the people and the elite a blank check for any action, a mandate for the unlimited power he had so craved. Ivan graciously agreed to return to the throne, but he set his conditions that would forever change the face of Russia. His main demand was the establishment of the Oprichnina. The word, derived from the Old Russian oprich, meaning apart or except, used to refer to the special portion of an estate left to a prince's widow. Ivan, however, gave it a new, sinister meaning. He demanded that the entire state be split in two. The first, larger part, was the Zemshchina, which would continue to live under the old laws, governed by the Boyar Duma. The second part, the Oprichnina, would become his personal special domain, his private inheritance. It included the richest and most strategically important lands in the center of the country, as well as certain streets in Moscow itself. In this new domain, the Tsar was the absolute, unrestricted master. He created his own Oprichnina treasury, his own council, and, most importantly, his own Oprichnina army, which answered only to him and was tasked with rooting out the sovereign's treason. The boyars and clergy, cornered by the fear of popular revolt and a power vacuum, were forced to agree to all his terms. Thus, under the guise of returning to the throne, Ivan IV had staged a coup d'état. He had created a second, parallel state within Russia, a state living under martial law, a personal dictatorship that would from now on hang over the rest of the country like a sword of Damocles. The dream of autocratic power, forged in childhood humiliation and polished in debates with Kurbsky, had finally taken on a terrible, ugly, and bloody form. The creation of the Oprichnina was only the first step. This new order now required its enforcers, its own Praetorian Guard, which would become the hands and fangs of the Tsar's wrath. Thus was born the Oprichnik army, or, as the people soon nicknamed them, the Sovereign's Dogs. About 1,000 men, later growing to 6,000, were recruited, mostly from low-born gentry, foreigners, and at times, simply adventurers of dubious origin. The main criterion for selection was not noble birth, but personal loyalty to the Tsar and a willingness to obey any order without question, regardless of its legality or morality. The Oprichniki swore a special oath, vowing to renounce their families and clans, to serve only the sovereign, and to inform on anyone plotting treason against him. They became a kind of military religious order, living by their own rules. The Oprichnik's appearance was meticulously designed and carried a gruesome symbolism. They dressed in black, monk-like robes, emphasizing their special ascetic status. From the saddles of their black horses, they hung two objects that struck terror into the entire country: a dog's head and a broom. The symbolism was perfectly clear. Like dogs, they would sniff out and tear apart the sovereign's enemies, and with the broom, they would sweep treason from the land. This masquerade, this quasi-satanic aesthetic, was no accident. It was designed to demoralize opponents, to show that the Oprichniki stood outside all human laws, that for them, neither morality nor pity existed. They were the living embodiment of the Tsar's anger, a punishing sword that could fall on anyone's head, regardless of their nobility or past service. The appearance of a detachment of black-clad horsemen with their grim attributes on the road meant only one thing: imminent death, torture, and ruin. The country was plunged into an atmosphere of thick, paralyzing fear. For now, anyone could be accused of treason, and the only judge and executioner was this new, terrible order of the sovereign's dogs. By establishing the Oprichnina, Ivan did not just create a punitive body. He tried to build a complex and perverse theological basis for the terror, turning the Alexandrov Sloboda into a kind of monastery in reverse. The Tsar, always an expert in church rituals, created a parody of a monastic brotherhood. He named himself Abbot, his chief executioner, Malyuta Skuratov, Kellerer, and his other close associates as the Brethren. The day in the Sloboda was run on a strict monastic schedule. At 4 in the morning, the abbot Ivan would personally climb the bell tower and ring the call to morning prayers. All Oprichniki were required to attend the long services, which lasted for hours. Those who were late were given penance by the abbot. Ivan himself would sing in the choir, read from the scriptures, and deliver sermons, in which he called on his brethren to fight mercilessly against the enemies of the faith and the sovereign. The service was followed by a meal, during which the Tsar would continue to read from the lives of the saints. But when night fell, this pious facade crumbled, and the Sloboda turned into a branch of hell. The daytime monks became nighttime executioners. In the cellars beneath the palace, the torture and interrogation of traitors, who were brought here from all over the country, would begin. Ivan often personally attended the torments, seeing them not just as a way to extract confessions, but as a sacred act of purification, of casting the demons of treason from the sinner's soul. After the tortures and executions, wild, debauched feasts would begin, where rivers of wine flowed, and the Tsar would force his Oprichniki to dance and sing, mixing the haze of blood with drunken revelry. This monstrous blend of fervent religiosity and sadistic cruelty, of prayer and torture, of fasting and debauchery, was a reflection of the schism in Ivan's own soul. He, apparently, seemed to genuinely believe that by destroying the bodies of his enemies, he was saving their souls and purifying his land from filth. The Oprichnina, in his sick imagination, was not just a political tool, but an eschatological mission, a final battle for Holy Russia, where any means were justified to defeat the devil. The flywheel of terror, set in motion at the Alexandrov Sloboda, began to spin with terrifying speed. Its first victims were representatives of the most noble and influential boyar families, those whom Ivan had suspected of treason and disloyalty ever since his illness. A methodical and demonstrative purge of the aristocratic elite began. Executions followed one after another, each one staged with monstrous theatrical cruelty. Princes from the Yaroslavsky and Rostovsky families were executed, boyars whose ancestors had been sovereign princes and rurikids, just like Ivan himself. One of the most respected military commanders, Prince Alexander Gorbatishvili, a hero of the siege of Kazan, was accused of conspiracy and executed along with his 17-year-old son. They were brought to the square. The father was forced to watch his son's execution before laying his own head on the block. Their distant relative, Prince Semyon Rostovsky, was impaled. The Tsar's own cousin, Prince Vladimir of Staritsa, the same one the boyars had wanted to place on the throne in 1553, was forced, according to legend, to take poison along with his entire family. The terror was not limited to the traitors themselves. Their families, including wives and young children, their servants, and even their peasants, were all subject to repression. Their estates were confiscated and absorbed into the Oprichnina. Entire boyar clans, which had been the bedrock of the state for centuries, were erased from the face of the earth. The purpose of these executions was not just to eliminate real or imagined opponents. The main goal was to sow universal, paralyzing terror. Ivan wanted to demonstrate, in no uncertain terms, that from now on, no one's nobility, wealth, or past achievements could protect them from the Tsar's wrath. He was destroying the old feudal structure based on clan honor and vassalage, and replacing it with a new one, where there was only one source of power and the right to life, the will of the sovereign. And the price of this new structure was written in the blood of thousands of the Russian elite. The apex and most terrible page in the history of the Oprichnina terror was the punitive campaign against Novgorod in the winter of 1569–70. Veliki Novgorod, once a free republic, had preserved its special status and spirit of independence even after being annexed by Moscow. It was the largest trade and cultural center, Muscovy's window to Europe. It was precisely this wealth and independence that had always aroused Ivan's suspicion. At the end of 1569, a denunciation, most likely fabricated, fell into the Tsar's hands, alleging that the elite of Novgorod, led by Archbishop Pimen, planned to surrender to the King of Poland. For Ivan's paranoid mind, this was all the proof he needed. He gathered a massive Oprichniki army and personally led the campaign against the city he now considered a nest of treason. What happened next defies description. The Oprichniki surrounded the city and unleashed a bloody, weeks-long massacre. Mass arrests and executions began. People were tortured in the most sophisticated ways to extract confessions of conspiracy. Then, they were executed by the thousand. According to the chronicles, every day, hundreds and thousands of townspeople, men, women, and children, were brought to the Volkhov River, bound together and thrown under the ice. Infants were tied to their mothers. Those who tried to surface were finished off by Oprichniki in boats with spears and axes. The slaughter continued for about 6 weeks. The city was completely plundered, its suburbs burned to the ground. Even churches and monasteries were looted. The exact number of victims is still unknown. Historians estimate the figure to be anywhere from 3,000 to 15,000 people, a colossal number for the time. The Novgorod campaign was not just an act of retribution, it was an act of symbolic annihilation. Ivan the Terrible was not just punishing traitors, he was ripping out the very memory of Novgorod's freedom, drowning the spirit of independence and resistance to his autocratic will in blood. This massacre became the climax of the Oprichnina's madness, after which even the Tsar's most ardent supporters began to realize that he had crossed a line, beyond which statecraft ends and pure, irrational evil begins. The Oprichnina, created as an elite force totally loyal to the Tsar to fight internal treason, should, in theory, have been the most combat-ready part of the army. The reality, however, proved otherwise. In May of 1571, at the height of the Livonian War, a massive army of the Crimean Khan, devout, descended on Russia's southern borders. The Crimeans, meeting no serious resistance from the border troops, advanced rapidly toward Moscow. The main forces of the Russian army, the Zemshchina troops, were on the western front. The capital was supposed to be defended by the Oprichniki, who were quartered nearby. And here, disaster struck. The Oprichniki army, accustomed to fighting unarmed citizens, merchants, and boyars, proved completely unprepared for a clash with a real, strong, and brutal enemy. Instead of giving battle to the Khan on the approaches to the city, the Oprichniki commanders showed complete confusion and cowardice. They failed to organize a defense and effectively abandoned the capital to its fate. As a result, devout reached Moscow unopposed and set its wooden suburbs on fire. The city went up like a matchstick, In a matter of hours, the capital of the Muscovite state burned to the ground, except for the stone Kremlin. Tens of thousands of people died in the fire or suffocated from the smoke. Tens of thousands more were led away into slavery. It was a terrible national humiliation, comparable to the worst days of the horde's yoke, and the blame for it lay entirely with the Oprichnina. This failure demonstrated to Ivan the Terrible, in the clearest possible terms, that his sovereign's dogs, while effective as a tool of terror, were utterly useless as a military force to defend the state. They knew how to rob and kill their own people, but they buckled in the face of a real enemy. This catastrophe was a cold shower for the Tsar. He realized that his experiment had gone too far, and that the monster he had created was not only devouring the country from within, but was also incapable of protecting it from external threats. The burning of Moscow was a moment of sobering clarity for Ivan the Terrible. As a pragmatic and intelligent, albeit cruel politician, he could not fail to see the complete failure of his signature creation. The Oprichnina had not only failed to strengthen, but had actually weakened the country's defense, led to the terrible ruin of the central regions, and earned the universal hatred of the populace. The terror, which had reached its zenith in the Novgorod massacre, was losing its effectiveness, devolving into senseless butchery. Moreover, the Oprichniki themselves, sensing their impunity, had begun to spin out of control, turning into common bandits concerned only with their own enrichment. Realizing all this, Ivan acted as he always did in critical situations, sharply and decisively. In the autumn of 1572, after a combined Zemshchina and Oprichnik army, under the command of Prince Vorotinsky, managed to defeat the Crimeans at the Battle of Molody, the Tsar abolished the Oprichnina. The very word was forbidden, on pain of death. The Oprichnina lands were returned to the Zemshchina. Many of the prominent Oprichniki, yesterday's favorites and executioners, were themselves executed on the Tsar's orders. It was as if he were trying to erase the memory of his 7-year bloody experiment from history. But this was impossible. Although the Oprichnina was formally abolished, its methods and spirit had already seeped deep into the fabric of the Russian state. Fear had become an integral part of the system of government. The idea that state interests, or what the ruler perceives them to be, stand above any law and any human life became firmly entrenched in the political consciousness. The Oprichnina destroyed the old boyar aristocracy, clearing the way for a new service nobility, completely dependent on the monarch. It dealt a terrible blow to the country's economy, leading to the desolation of entire regions. But most of all, it left a profound trauma in the national memory, creating the image of the Tsar tyrant and forever linking the idea of a strong state with the idea of limitless violence in Russian history. The end of the Oprichnina did not bring Ivan spiritual peace. The terror he had unleashed on his country now took up residence in his own palace, in his own soul. He continued to see treason all around him. His suspicion knew no bounds, and his fits of rage became increasingly uncontrollable. And in November 1581, a tragedy occurred that became the most terrible and ironic outcome of his entire reign. In a fit of rage, during an argument with his eldest son and heir, the Tsarevich Ivan, the Tsar struck him in the temple with his staff. The blow was fatal. When the rage subsided and Ivan saw his beloved son bleeding at his feet, he was overcome with horror and despair. He reportedly howled like a wounded animal, clutching his son's body, trying to stop the blood, calling for doctors and begging God for a miracle. But it was all in vain. A few days later, the Tsarevich died. This act of filicide was the apotheosis of Ivan the Terrible's tragedy. His entire life, he had fought to strengthen his power and ensure its transfer to his heirs. He had drowned thousands in blood, destroyed the most noble families, and split his country in two, all so that his dynasty could rule forever. And now, in a single instant, with a single blow of his own staff, he himself had doomed that dynasty to extinction. His second son, Fyodor, was a weak and sickly man, incapable of ruling, and his youngest son, Dmitri, was still an infant. By killing his heir, Ivan had effectively drawn a line through his entire life's work. This was not just a family tragedy. It was a judgment of historical proportions. Fate had mocked him with the cruelest jest of all. The tyrant who had destroyed countless families for the sake of his own, in the end, became the executioner of his own line. The grand and terrifying chess match he had been playing on the board of history had ended in a checkmate he had delivered to himself. The final years of Ivan the Terrible's life were a dark epilogue to his turbulent and bloody era. After killing his son, he was seized by a deep, agonizing remorse. He sent vast sums of money to monasteries for the salvation of the souls of all those he had killed, compiling so-called synodiki, long lists of his victims, so that prayers could be said for them day and night. But this repentance coexisted strangely with his old suspiciousness and a superstitious fear of death. His once mighty body was exhausted by decades of nervous tension, debauchery, and possibly treatment with poisonous mercury ointments. He suffered from severe illnesses. His body swelled and was covered in sores. Sensing the end was near, he surrounded himself not only with monks and priests, but also with astrologers and sorcerers whom he had brought from Lapland, trying to learn the date of his death and, if possible, to cheat fate. Death found him on March 18th, 1584. According to the English ambassador, Jerome Horsey, the Tsar, feeling better that day, sat down to play chess with his associate, Bogdan Belsky. He had just set up the pieces himself, but had not yet made a move. Suddenly, he faltered and collapsed, dead. Thus ended the earthly journey of one of the most complex and contradictory rulers in world history. His death was symbolic. The great player, who had spent his life moving living people across the chessboard of Russian history like pawns, departed this life without having started his final game. He left behind a country devastated by a long war and by terror, a country without a strong heir, on the brink of a great time of troubles. But he also left another legacy, a vast centralized state, stretching from the White Sea to the Caspian, and from the Lithuanian border into Siberia. He departed, leaving behind not an answer, but an eternal, agonizing question about the price of greatness and the terrifying line where a nation's savior becomes its executioner. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible has proven to be as contradictory as the man himself. For centuries, his figure has been a battlefield for historians, writers, and politicians who have shaped his image to fit their own views and agendas. For 19th-century liberal historiography, represented by names like Karamzin and Kostomarov, Ivan IV was above all a bloody tyrant, an Asiatic despot whose reign was a national catastrophe that threw Russia backward in its development. They saw his cruelty as a manifestation of his sick, depraved nature and the main cause of all Russia's woes. However, another view also existed. Statists, from Slavophiles to imperial historians, saw him primarily as a great statesman, a severe but necessary ruler who gathered the Russian lands with an iron hand, fought the separatism of the aristocracy, and laid the foundations of the mighty Russian Empire. They justified his cruelty as a state necessity, arguing that in that harsh era, it was impossible to govern by any other means. This second image gained particular traction in the 20th century, when Joseph Stalin saw Ivan the Terrible as his direct historical predecessor. On Stalin's orders, the director Sergei Eisenstein made his famous film, Ivan the Terrible, where the Tsar was portrayed as a tragic hero, forced to resort to terror in his struggle against reactionary, traitorous boyars for the good of the state. In this interpretation, the Oprichnina was presented as a progressive phenomenon, a kind of revolution from above. Thus, in the historical memory of the Russian people, there are, in effect, two Ivans, an icon of bloody madness and an icon of strong state power. And this duality, this impossibility of giving him a single, simple assessment, only underscores the colossal scale of his personality and the deep, unhealed wound he left on his country's history. And so, we return to the main question, to the central paradox that began our story. Why did the most devout of Tsars create the dog Oprichniki? The answer, as we can now see, is complex and layered, and it does not lie in simple hypocrisy. The Oprichnina was not a rejection of Ivan's faith, but its monstrous, heretical, and twisted product. The key to this riddle lies in his unique, deeply personalized understanding of religion and power. The trauma, humiliation, and fear he endured in childhood forged in him an absolute conviction that the world was riddled with evil and betrayal, and that the boyar aristocracy was its main carrier. The death of his beloved wife Anastasia and the flight of his friend Kurbsky turned this conviction into a paranoid obsession. In his mind, the struggle to consolidate his personal power merged with an apocalyptic battle to save Holy Russia from the forces of hell. As God's anointed, he considered himself not just a ruler, but an instrument of divine wrath and retribution. In this perverse theology, terror became not a sin, but a sacred ritual, a painful but necessary surgical operation to remove the cancerous tumor of treason from the body of the state. The Oprichniki, in this worldview, were not mere executioners, but a kind of exterminating angel, his blood-stained scalpel. Their black, monk-like robes, their life in the Alexandrov Sloboda, which was modeled on a monastery, all of this was an attempt to give terror a sacred, ritualistic character. Ivan saw no contradiction between his hours-long prayers and the tortures that followed, because for him, both were acts of service to the same goal, the purification of his tsardom from filth. He was like an Old Testament prophet who, carrying out the will of a wrathful God, destroys entire cities. The paradox of Ivan the Terrible is the paradox of a man who wanted so badly to build the kingdom of God on earth that he failed to notice when his methods became those of the devil himself. The story of Ivan the Terrible is not just a tale from the distant 16th century. It is an eternal warning about the nature of power and the dark abysses hidden in the human soul. It teaches us that absolute power, unlimited by law, morality, or independent institutions, inevitably corrupts absolutely, even if its wielder originally had good intentions. It shows how a deep personal trauma endured in childhood can, decades later, echo in the fate of an entire nation, turning state policy into a means of exorcising one's own demons and settling personal scores. The story of Grozny is a clear example of how the noblest idea, be it building a strong state or protecting the true faith, can be taken to a monstrous extreme and twisted into its dark opposite, when any means, even the most inhuman, are used to achieve it. It is a reminder of the dangerous line where a leader who sees himself as a messiah and savior becomes a tyrant and an executioner. And perhaps the most important lesson of this dark epic is that the greatest threat to any people is not an external enemy, but a ruler who claims the right to speak for God, who is convinced of his own infallibility, and who believes that the ends justify any means, because the path paved with such convictions inevitably leads to hell, even if it was first aimed toward heaven. And the echo of Ivan the Terrible's footsteps, and those of his black-clad horsemen, still resounds loudly in the corridors of history, reminding us of this simple and terrible truth.